On a crisp autumn morning at New York's JFK Airport, the first-class lounge buzzed with its usual crowd of business travelers and wealthy passengers. Among them sat David Reynolds, a 45-year-old hedge fund manager who practically radiated self-importance. His Italian leather briefcase rested beside his perfectly polished shoes, and his custom-tailored suit probably cost more than what most people earned in a month. David wasn't just rich. He was the kind of rich that made him believe the world revolved around him. As he sipped his premium coffee, he barely looked up from his phone, firing off emails with one hand while dismissively waving away a lounge attendant with the other. The way he carried himself made it clear. He wasn't just flying first class. He thought he owned the skies. Time ticked by, and finally, the announcement for Flight AA 307 to Los Angeles echoed through the terminal. David didn't rush. People like him never did. He waited until the final first-class boarding call before gathering his things, knowing full well everyone else would have to wait. As he strolled down the jet bridge, he typed away on his phone, not bothering to look up at anyone. The plane's entrance was his stage, and he was about to make his grand entrance. The Boeing 787's first-class cabin gleamed with luxury, soft leather seats, mood lighting, and the promise of five-star treatment. Standing at the entrance was Lily Wong, a flight attendant whose 15 years of experience showed in her warm, professional smile. She had seen thousands of passengers come and go, from humble grandparents to famous celebrities, and treated them all with the same genuine kindness. Her uniform was crisp, her smile authentic, and her patience legendary among her colleagues. "Good morning, sir. Welcome aboard. May I help you find your seat?" Lily's voice carried that perfect blend of warmth and professionalism that came from years of practice. But David didn't even glance up. He just thrust his boarding pass in her general direction, still absorbed in his phone conversation. "I know where I'm going," he muttered, brushing past her. The other first-class passengers watched this interaction with subtle disapproval. Among them was an elderly gentleman in seat 3C, who observed the scene with particular interest, his eyes twinkling with something that might have been amusement, or perhaps something else entirely. David made his way to his seat, 2A, by the window, like he was walking through his own living room. He started arranging his space before the plane had even finished boarding, pressing the call button repeatedly. Each chime echoed through the cabin like a tiny announcement of his self-perceived importance. The other passengers were settling in quietly, some catching up on work, others already closing their eyes for a quick nap. But David seemed determined to make his presence known. He pulled out his laptop, spread out his documents, and began a loud phone conversation about his latest million-dollar deal. "Listen, tell Thompson I don't care about his concerns. The merger is happening whether he likes it or not. Do you know how much I'm worth? I didn't get to where I am by playing nice." His voice carried through the cabin, making several passengers wince at his lack of awareness, or perhaps his lack of caring. Lily approached his seat again, maintaining her professional demeanor. "Sir, could I offer you a pre-flight beverage? Perhaps some champagne?" She knew from experience that sometimes a good drink could soften even the hardest edges of difficult passengers. David barely looked up, just flicking his wrist in what might have been a yes gesture while continuing his phone conversation. The elderly man in 3C watched this entire scene unfold, his expression unreadable, but his attention unwavering. Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning of what would become an unforgettable flight, especially for David. The stage was set, the players were in position, and in the next few minutes, something would happen that would change David's perspective forever. But for now, he remained in his bubble of self-importance, completely unaware that he was about to learn one of life's most valuable lessons in just 30 seconds. The flight was preparing for takeoff when David's behavior started getting worse. He kept pressing the call button every few minutes, treating it like his personal doorbell. Lily would appear each time with the same patient smile, though anyone paying attention could see the strain beginning to show in her eyes. "Where's my champagne?" David demanded, not even looking up from his phone. "First class means first service, doesn't it?" His voice carried that entitled tone that made other passengers sink lower in their seats from second-hand embarrassment. Lily calmly explained, "I apologize, sir, but we can't serve alcohol until we're safely in the air. It's airline policy. I'll be happy to bring it to you as soon as we take off." She spoke clearly and professionally, just as she'd done thousands of times before. But David wasn't having it. "Do you know who I am?" He finally looked up, his face reddening. "I spend more on flights in a month than you make in a year. I could buy this entire row if I wanted to." He waved his platinum credit card in the air as if it were some kind of magic wand. A young mother in seat 2B tried to distract her curious child, who was watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. The businessman across the aisle buried his face deeper in his newspaper, pretending not to notice. But everyone was listening. How could they not? "Look," David continued, his voice getting louder, "I've got a meeting with the board of directors as soon as I land. I need to relax, and I need that champagne now." He punctuated each word by tapping his armrest, like a judge with a gavel. The elderly man in 3C shifted in his seat, taking off his reading glasses and placing them carefully in his shirt pocket. He had been quietly observing everything since boarding, making mental notes with each interaction. Lily maintained her composure, though her hands clasped together a bit tighter. "Sir, I understand you're eager to relax, but safety regulations are clear. I can offer you still or sparkling water for now, and I'll have your champagne ready the moment we reach cruising altitude." David scoffed, pulling out his phone again. "What's your employee number? I'll be filing a complaint. This is ridiculous. I fly first class to avoid these kinds of issues." He started typing aggressively on his phone, muttering under his breath about incompetent service and wasting my valuable time. A flight attendant in training named Amy watched from the galley, amazed at how Lily handled the situation. She'd only been on the job for 2 weeks, and already she was learning that the biggest challenges often came in designer suits. The plane began to taxi, and Lily made one final pass through the cabin, checking seatbelts. When she reached David's row, he made a show of adjusting his own belt, rolling his eyes dramatically. "I've been flying since before you were born," he announced to no one in particular. "I don't need anyone to check if I can handle a simple seatbelt." The elderly man in 3C cleared his throat softly, reaching for the air sickness bag in his seat pocket. But instead of opening it, he pulled out what looked like a small notebook and began writing something down. As the plane accelerated down the runway, David continued his complaints, now loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. This airline used to know how to treat its premium customers. Standards have really slipped. When we land, I'm calling my friend on the board. We'll see how long some people keep their jobs. Little did David know, his words were having an effect, just not the one he intended. The elderly man had stopped writing and was now sitting up straighter, his expression changing from passive observation to something more determined. In the next few moments, this flight was about to take an unexpected turn, and David's world was about to be flipped upside down. The plane lifted off the ground, climbing into the cloudy New York sky. Some passengers closed their eyes, others gazed out their windows, but everyone in first class was secretly waiting to see what would happen next. They could feel it in the air. Something was about to break this tension, and when it did, it would be unforgettable. Finally, the seatbelt sign clicked off, and Lily began preparing the drink service. She moved with practiced efficiency, knowing it was best to serve David first, not because he deserved special treatment, but because it might bring some peace to the cabin. "Your champagne, sir," she said, carefully placing a crystal flute on his tray table. The golden liquid sparkled under the cabin lights, tiny bubbles racing to the surface. David barely acknowledged her presence, still typing furiously on his laptop about some urgent business deal. As Lily leaned forward to place a crisp white napkin beside the glass, The plane hit a small patch of turbulence. It wasn't much, just enough to make the overhead bins creak, but David chose that exact moment to reach for his drink. His elbow bumped against Lily's arm, sending the champagne splashing across his expensive silk tie and white shirt. The reaction was immediate and explosive. "Look what you did," David shouted, jumping up from his seat despite the lingering seatbelt sign. "This suit costs more than your monthly salary. Are you completely incompetent?" Lily quickly pulled out extra napkins from her apron. "I'm so sorry, sir. Let me help you clean that up. Club soda will prevent any staining." But David wasn't interested in solutions. "Don't touch me or my suit." He was causing such a scene that a baby in economy class started crying. "I want to speak to your supervisor right now." "No, scratch that. I want the contact information for your corporate office. This is absolutely unacceptable." A young businessman across the aisle offered his own napkin. "Sir, it was just an accident. I saw what happened. The plane." "Mind your own business," David snapped, cutting him off. "This is between me and this completely unprofessional excuse for a flight attendant." His face had turned an alarming shade of red, and his designer glasses slipped down his nose as he continued his tirade. Lily stood there, maintaining her dignity despite the verbal assault. Her hands were steady as she held the club soda and napkins, but those who looked closely might have noticed her lower lip trembling slightly. The elderly man in 3C had seen enough. He closed the notebook he'd been writing in and slowly stood up. Nobody paid much attention to him at first, just another passenger probably heading to the bathroom. But then he cleared his throat, and something in that small sound made everyone, including David, turn to look. "I believe," the elderly man said in a clear, authoritative voice that carried throughout the cabin, "that this might be a good time for me to introduce myself." He wasn't tall or particularly imposing, but something about his presence commanded attention. David, still dabbing at his shirt with a napkin, sneered, "Unless you're the CEO of this airline, I really don't care who you are." A small smile appeared on the elderly man's face. "Well, that's where things get interesting." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. "My name is Robert Chen, and as a matter of fact, I am the CEO of this airline." The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a peanut drop in economy class. David's face went from red to white so fast it was almost comical. The other passengers froze in their seats, drinks halfway to their mouths, newspapers suspended mid-turn. For a moment, time seemed to stand still in that pressurized cabin at 35,000 feet. The mighty David Reynolds, who moments ago had been threatening everyone's jobs, suddenly looked very small in his champagne-stained designer suit. The next 30 seconds were about to become the most memorable half-minute of David's life, and not in the way he would have ever expected. The CEO straightened his simple blue tie, and everyone in first class held their breath, waiting to hear what would happen next. CEO Robert Chen didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The entire first-class cabin was hanging on his every word. He straightened his simple blue tie and looked directly at David, whose champagne-stained suit suddenly seemed less impressive. "Mr. Reynolds," the CEO began, consulting his little notebook, "I've been sitting here for the past hour, watching how you've treated one of our most valuable team members. Would you like to know what I've observed?" David opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His phone, which had seemed permanently attached to his hand earlier, now lay forgotten on his tray table. "Lily Wong isn't just any flight attendant," Robert continued, his voice carrying a gentle but firm authority. "She's been with our airline for 15 years. Last year, she received our highest service award after successfully helping deliver a baby on a trans-Pacific flight. The mother named the baby girl after her." A soft murmur rippled through the cabin. The young businessman who had tried to help earlier nodded appreciatively. Even the baby in economy class had stopped crying, as if sensing the importance of the moment. But that's not all, Robert went on, flipping a page in his notebook. 3 months ago, Lily spotted a passenger having a silent heart attack. Her quick action and calm leadership saved that man's life. He wrote us a letter about it. I keep it on my desk as a reminder of what real excellence looks like. David sank lower in his seat, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning dew under a hot sun. The CEO wasn't finished. Just last month, she was promoted to head of our cabin crew training program. Starting next week, she'll be responsible for teaching our new flight attendants the art of professional service, the very thing you've been criticizing so loudly. A flight attendant trainee in the galley wiped away a tear, looking at Lily with newfound admiration. The young mother in 2B was smiling, and her child was watching the scene unfold like it was better than any tablet game. Now, Robert said, placing his notebook back in his pocket, let me tell you what's going to happen next. Our system shows you've been a frequent flyer with us for 6 years. You've accumulated quite a few miles, and you've enjoyed many privileges. David's face, which had been pale, now turned slightly green. He knew what was coming. Those privileges, Mr. Reynolds, are not rights. They're a reflection of our company's appreciation for loyal customers who treat our staff with respect. Based on what I've witnessed today, I'm afraid we'll have to reevaluate your status with us. The CEO pulled out his phone, pressed a few buttons, and continued, I've just sent an email to our membership department. Your frequent flyer status has been revoked, effective immediately. Furthermore, you'll no longer be eligible for first-class bookings on any of our routes. Someone in the back of first class started to applaud, but quickly thought better of it. The silence was more powerful anyway. But sir, David finally found his voice, though it was barely a whisper, my business, my meetings. There are many airlines flying between New York and Los Angeles, Mr. Reynolds, Robert replied calmly. I suggest you explore your options. Though I hope, wherever you choose to fly, you'll remember this moment and treat their staff with the respect they deserve. The CEO turned to Lily, who had been standing quietly throughout this exchange. Ms. Wong, thank you for maintaining our highest standards, even in difficult circumstances. Would you mind bringing me a cup of coffee when you have a moment? Black, no sugar. Of course, sir, Lily replied professionally, as if the last hour hadn't happened at all. As she turned to walk to the galley, passengers could see her standing a little taller, her shoulders a little straighter. David Reynolds, the mighty hedge fund manager who had started his day believing he owned the skies, now sat silently in his champagne-stained suit. The next 4 hours to Los Angeles suddenly felt very long indeed, and an important lesson about humility was slowly sinking in. The next hour of the flight passed in a strange kind of silence. David sat motionless in his champagne-stained suit, staring out the window at the endless sea of clouds below. His phone, which had been his constant companion, remained untouched. For perhaps the first time in years, he was forced to sit with his thoughts. Every time Lily passed by his seat, performing her duties with perfect professionalism, he felt a fresh wave of shame wash over him. The other passengers pretended not to notice him, but he could feel their sideways glances. The mighty man who had boarded the plane just hours ago now seemed to be trying his best to disappear into his seat. In the galley, the flight attendant trainee watched Lily with awe as she prepared the lunch service. How do you do it? She whispered. How do you stay so calm when someone treats you that way? Lily smiled warmly while arranging the food trays. In 15 years, I've learned that kindness is always the best response. Sometimes, the rudest passengers are just having their worst day. Our job isn't to judge them, but to make their journey a little better. Meanwhile, CEO Robert Chen was engaged in a quiet conversation with the young mother in 2B. Her little boy had fallen asleep, clutching his toy airplane. You know, Robert said softly, I started as a baggage handler 40 years ago. Spent every day watching planes take off, dreaming of being part of something bigger. The mother smiled, adjusting her son's blanket. And now you own the airline. No, Robert chuckled. The shareholders own the airline. I just try to make sure we never forget that our real business isn't flying planes. It's taking care of people. As lunch service began, David noticed something surprising. Lily approached his seat with the same gentle smile she gave everyone else. Would you prefer the chicken or the pasta today, sir? She asked, as if the earlier incident had never happened. David's voice was barely above a whisper. The chicken, please. And, I'm sorry about earlier. The words seemed to catch in his throat, but they were sincere. Lily nodded graciously, placing his meal before him with the same care she showed to every passenger. The CEO, watching from his seat, nodded approvingly while sipping his coffee. A few rows back, two business travelers were whispering about what they'd witnessed. Did you see his face when he found out who the CEO was? One asked. I've never seen someone's attitude change so fast. I heard about this CEO, the other replied quietly. They say he takes random flights every month, sitting in different sections just to see how things really work. Guess our friend in 2A picked the wrong day to be a jerk. The lunch service continued smoothly, but something had changed in the cabin's atmosphere. Other passengers began chatting with Lily, asking about her experiences, genuinely interested in her stories. The young boy woke up and drew her a picture of an airplane, which she promised to keep forever. David ate his meal in silence, but his eyes kept darting to the CEO, who was now helping an elderly passenger connect to the plane's Wi-Fi. Here was the most powerful person on the plane, serving others instead of demanding service. As the food trays were being cleared, David pulled out a blank piece of paper from his briefcase. With hands that trembled slightly, he began to write. The words didn't come easily. Apologies never do when they're genuine, but slowly the note took shape. The plane cruised on through the afternoon sky, carrying its usual mix of travelers, business people, families, dreamers, and one very humbled hedge fund manager. Outside, the sun painted the clouds in shades of gold, reminding everyone that sometimes the most valuable lessons come at the most unexpected moments, at 35,000 feet above the ground. As the flight entered its final hours, David looked down at the letter he'd been writing. He'd gone through several drafts, crumpling up his previous attempts and starting over each time. Nothing seemed quite right. How do you apologize for treating someone like they're beneath you? The turbulence light dinged off, and Lily moved through the cabin, checking on passengers. David watched as she helped an elderly woman with her crossword puzzle, suggested a movie to a restless teenager, and somehow remembered exactly how each person liked their coffee. Finally, after what seemed like hours, David finished his letter. He folded it carefully and held it in his hands, gathering his courage. His Rolex watch, which had earlier seemed like such an important status symbol, now felt strangely heavy on his wrist. "Excuse me," he said softly as Lily passed by. His voice was different now. No trace of the earlier arrogance remained. Would you please read this when you have a moment?" Lily accepted the folded paper with a gentle nod. There was no judgment in her eyes, just that same professional warmth she showed to everyone. David noticed for the first time that she wore a small pin on her uniform, an award for 15 years of service. In the galley, Lily unfolded the letter. The CEO, who was helping himself to another coffee, pretended not to notice, but his eyes crinkled with interest. "Dear Lily," the letter began. "I've spent the last hour trying to find the right words. I'm not used to admitting when I'm wrong. Today, I wasn't just wrong. I was cruel, arrogant, and completely out of line. Your professionalism in the face of my behavior shows more class than I could ever hope to have, regardless of how expensive my suit is." Lily paused reading for a moment, touching the corner of her eye. The young trainee nearby offered her a tissue, but Lily shook her head and continued reading. "My mother was a waitress for 30 years, the letter went on. She worked 2 jobs to put me through business school. somewhere between my first million and my corner office. I forgot her lessons about treating everyone with respect. She would be ashamed of my behavior today. I'm ashamed of it. The CEO quietly poured a second cup of coffee and placed it near Lily as she read. I know an apology doesn't erase what I did. You deserve better than to be treated that way by anyone, let alone someone who mistook wealth for worth. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that you've taught me something valuable today, something all my business success couldn't teach me. In his seat, David was staring out the window again, but he wasn't really seeing the clouds. He was remembering his mother's face, how proud she'd been at his graduation. What would she say if she'd seen him today? The letter continued. Your CEO mentioned that you'll be training new flight attendants. I hope you'll share this story with them. Tell them about the passenger who thought he was better than everyone else, until they learned he was actually the least worthy person in the cabin. They should know that true class has nothing to do with which section of the plane you sit in. Lily folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her pocket. The CEO spoke quietly. In 40 years of flying, that might be the most genuine apology I've ever seen. She smiled, wiping away a small tear. Sometimes people just need a moment to remember who they really are. Back in the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold. The young boy, who had been watching everything unfold, was coloring a picture of an airplane, carefully making sure all the people in his drawing were smiling, including the flight attendants. David pulled out his phone, but instead of checking emails, he opened his photos. There was his mother in her waitress uniform, arm around his shoulders at his college graduation. He touched the screen gently, a lesson learned far above the earth finally finding its way home to his heart. As the plane began its gradual descent into Los Angeles, something remarkable was happening throughout the cabin. The story of what had transpired was spreading like ripples in a pond, passed in whispers from first class to economy, taking on an almost magical quality in its retelling. Flight attendants from economy class found excuses to peek into first class during their breaks, eager to catch a glimpse of both the humbled businessman and their celebrated colleague. One young passenger in economy, after hearing the story from her seatmate, pulled out her phone and started writing a social media post about kindness and karma. The CEO had moved to chat with different passengers, sharing stories about his early days loading baggage onto planes in the snow. You know what's funny? He told a curious teenager. Back then, I thought my job was handling luggage. Now I know I was learning how to handle people, with care, respect, and always right side up. His easy laugh made everyone around him smile. Lily continued her duties, but now passengers noticed things they hadn't before. How she remembered their drink preferences without asking. How she spotted a nervous flyer and quietly offered reassurance. How she somehow managed to find an extra blanket for an elderly passenger who hadn't even asked for one. David watched all of this from his seat, his expensive leather briefcase now tucked away, forgotten. He'd spent the last hour looking through old photos on his phone. His mother's diner, his first apartment, the beat-up car he drove in college. Each image reminded him of a time when success was measured by kindness rather than bank accounts. A bit of turbulence shook the plane, and Lily smoothly steadied herself while checking on passengers. The CEO noticed how she instinctively reached out to secure a passenger's laptop before it could slide off their tray table. That's the kind of detail you can't teach, he murmured appreciatively. The young mother with her son had been watching everything unfold. She turned to the CEO and asked, "Will the story get out? About what happened today?" Robert smiled thoughtfully. "In my experience, the best lessons tend to spread themselves. They travel from person to person, changing a little with each telling, but keeping their heart intact. Like that drawing your son made. See how he gave everyone wings." The boy had indeed drawn all the people with tiny wings, including David in his champagne-stained suit. Something about the child's innocent interpretation of the day's events made several nearby passengers tear up. As the pilot announced their final approach, David noticed something that hit him hard. Lily was helping another passenger with their bag, and on her wrist was a watch. Not an expensive one like his Rolex, but a simple timepiece with a worn leather strap. He remembered his mother wearing one just like it during her long shifts at the diner. "Phones aren't allowed during landings, sir," Lily reminded him gently, noticing he was still holding his. For the first time since the incident, their eyes truly met. David saw no anger there, no resentment. Just the simple dignity of someone who knew exactly who they were and what they were worth. "Thank you," he said, and they both knew he wasn't just talking about the reminder about his phone. As he tucked it away, he noticed a text from his mother that he'd ignored that morning. "Hope you have a safe flight, honey. Remember to be kind to everyone. You never know what someone else is going through." The plane descended through the clouds, the sprawling city of Los Angeles spreading out below them like a glittering carpet. In moments of transition like this, between heaven and earth, sometimes people find clarity. Today, a simple flight from New York to Los Angeles had become something more. A lesson in humanity that would stick with everyone who witnessed it. Even the champagne stain on David's suits seemed different now. Less like a mark of shame and more like a badge of learning. Sometimes life's most important lessons leave a mark, reminding us of the moment everything changed. The Los Angeles airport came into view as the plane made its final approach. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the runways, and passengers began gathering their belongings. But this wasn't just another landing. Something had changed in the air above America that day. In the galley, flight attendants were quietly discussing what they'd witnessed. "I'm going to tell this story at every training session," the young trainee whispered to her colleagues. About how Lily handled it, about the CEO, about everything. Others nodded in agreement, knowing this would become one of those legendary airline stories that get passed down through the years. The CEO had returned to his seat, but not before leaving something on Lily's crew desk, his business card with a handwritten note. "Thank you for showing us all what excellence really means." Below that, he'd added his personal email address, a rare gesture from someone at his level. David was sitting quietly, lost in thought. He pulled out his mother's picture one last time before stowing his phone. The image of her in her waitress uniform, smiling proudly at his college graduation, seemed to speak to him now in a way it hadn't before. He remembered how she'd handled difficult customers, with grace, patience, and unshakable dignity. Just like Lily. The young boy who'd been watching everything unfold was excitedly telling his mother about his plans. "When I grow up," he declared, "I want to be like that nice lady who helps everyone. Or maybe like that kind man who runs the whole airplane company." His mother smiled, knowing her son had witnessed something more valuable than any in-flight entertainment. As the wheels touched down with a gentle bump, Lily's voice came over the intercom, smooth and professional as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. Local time is 4:30 p.m., and the temperature is a beautiful 75 degrees. Please remain seated until the captain turns off the fasten seatbelt sign." The other passengers noticed something remarkable. David was waiting patiently in his seat, no longer the entitled man who would have normally jumped up immediately to grab his bags. The champagne stain on his suit had dried into an obvious mark, but somehow he didn't seem to care anymore. A businessman across the aisle leaned over and spoke quietly to David. "You know, I used to be a lot like you. Then one day, my car broke down, and the only person who stopped to help was someone I'd looked down on at work. Changed my whole perspective." David nodded, understanding perfectly. As passengers began to deplane, they moved differently than usual. Instead of the typical rush to get off, people were letting others go first, sharing smiles, helping with bags. The story of what had happened had spread throughout the cabin, and it was as if everyone wanted to prove they'd learned its lesson. The CEO stood by his seat, shaking hands with crew members and passengers alike. "Remember," he told the young trainee who was watching Lily with admiration, The real measure of a person isn't how they treat their equals or superiors. It's how they treat those they think can't help them. Lily stood at the door, saying goodbye to passengers with the same warm smile she greeted them with hours ago. When David approached, he paused for a moment. "I'll never forget this flight," he said softly, "and I'll never be that person again." She nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "Safe travels, sir. And remember, kindness is always free, even in first class." It was said without malice, almost like a gentle teacher sharing a final lesson with a student. As David walked through the jet bridge into the terminal, he pulled out his phone one last time. But instead of checking stocks or emails, he dialed a number he should have called more often. "Hi, Mom," he said as he walked, his voice catching slightly. "Do you have time for coffee? There's something I need to tell you about my flight today." Behind him, the plane sat quietly at the gate, just another aircraft at just another terminal. But everyone who'd been aboard knew differently. They'd witnessed something rare and precious. The moment when wealth met wisdom, and wisdom won. 1 month after that memorable flight, the story had taken on a life of its own. It spread through break rooms and training sessions, across social media and airport lounges, becoming a modern-day parable about humility, respect, and the true meaning of first-class behavior. At the airline's headquarters, Lily's letter from David was framed and hung in the new flight attendant training center. Below it, a simple plaque read, "Sometimes the most important journeys happen within ourselves." New trainees would stop and read it, understanding that their job was about more than just serving drinks and giving safety instructions. The CEO had made some changes too. He introduced a new company-wide initiative called the First Class Heart Program, where employees at all levels would regularly work different positions to better understand each other's challenges. Even senior executives could now be found loading baggage or serving snacks on flights. David's transformation proved to be more than just a momentary change of heart. The following week, he'd surprised his mother by showing up at her old diner. He sat at the counter, ordered coffee, and spent hours watching her work, really seeing her for the first time in years. The way she remembered every regular's order, how she treated each person with dignity, the silent strength in her tired smile. "Mom," he'd said as she refilled his cup, "I finally understand what you've been trying to teach me all these years." The young boy who'd witnessed everything on the flight had drawn a picture that now hung in the airline's main office. In crayon colors, it showed a plane where everyone, passengers, crew, and even the CEO, had wings and smiles. It captured perfectly what the airline wanted to represent, a place where everyone could soar together. The champagne-stained suit. David had it professionally cleaned but kept one small mark as a reminder. He even started telling the story in his business meetings, usually before discussing numbers or deals. "Let me tell you about the most expensive glass of champagne I never drank," he'd begin, and people would lean in, knowing they were about to hear something important. The young trainee who'd watched Lily handle the situation with such grace was now leading her own training sessions. "Remember," she'd tell her students, "we're not just serving passengers, we're serving people. Each one has a story, each one deserves respect, and yes, each one might be the CEO in disguise." Back at the diner, David's mother noticed the changes in her son. He called more often, asked about her day, and actually listened to the answers. One evening, she found an envelope in her apron pocket. Inside was a first-class ticket to visit her sister in Florida, along with a note, "From your son, who finally learned what first class really means." Lily continued her work, unaware that she'd become something of a legend in the airline industry. She still treated everyone with the same warm professionalism, from celebrities to students flying on budget tickets. When asked about that famous flight, she'd simply smile and say, "Every interaction is a chance to show people their own best selves." The airline's customer satisfaction scores had never been higher. Not because of fancy meals or comfortable seats, but because of a culture change that started at 35,000 feet with a spilled glass of champagne. In board meetings, the CEO would often point to their rising numbers and say, "This isn't about profits. It's about proving that kindness is the ultimate luxury." And David? He still flew first class occasionally, but something was different. He'd make a point of learning the flight attendants' names, asking about their day, treating them like the professionals they were. Sometimes he even shared his own story with seatmates who seemed too focused on their importance. "You see this tiny mark on my suit?" he'd say, pointing to the barely visible reminder of that fateful flight. "It's worth more than all the champagne in France. Let me tell you why." The story continues to spread, changing little details here and there in its retelling, but always keeping its heart intact. It reminds us that true class has nothing to do with where you sit on the plane. It's about how you treat the people around you, no matter who they are or what they do. After all, in life as in flight, we're all just traveling together through the same sky.